Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar for Experience Key Action 1 Vet and Adult Education Projects. In this webinar, we will be outlining and recapping the key information from previous years and addressing the main themes in relation to this key action for the 2020 project. My name is Idoia, and I'm an Assistant Project Manager, and I hope you find this webinar useful. Please note that throughout the course of this webinar, we will be mentioning the project officer. As of yet, this information has not been disclosed to you, but your project officer will be communicating with you in due time. As you know, the project officer is your main point of contact that will answer your queries relating to your 2020 project. Moving on to the agenda for today. Here is the agenda with the topics that we are going to cover. There will be a quick introduction to changes to the program for 2020 with some key reminders regarding grant agreements, how to maintain records, and what evidence to retain and reports that must be submitted to the national agency. We will also cover how responsibilities should be divided, what support and monitoring the national agency provides, tips for using Mobility Tool Plus and OLS, advice on dissemination techniques, and signposts for further information. Moving on to the next slide. Here we can see what is new for 2020. Some of you may be wondering if there are many changes to the 2020 goal, but in short, you should be aware that there are no major changes in activities, budget, or grant agreements since the last call, which was 2019. However, the changes made in 2019 are still applicable. I am now going to cover them quickly in case some of you haven't had a 2019 project to run. Moving on to the next slide. So here we can see a recap of 2019 changes. Firstly, all duration of mobilities are now calculated as an average. This was introduced to allow for some flexibility regarding mobility durations, especially for larger projects. It is important that even though it is not an exact number, the duration and the budget you applied for is on track throughout the course of your project. Following on from this, mobilities are no longer organized in flows. At application stage, they were entered per activity type and country group within the activity, along with the average duration of all the flows to the same country group. The budget was calculated using these averages. In the application form, it was only necessary to indicate the group of countries the receiving country belongs to in the 2020 application form, rather than the exact country. There are 3 groups, and each group has different unit costs, which is how your budget was calculated. Moving on to the next slide. There have also been some changes that relate to the budget. You are now able to include participants who do not require a grant for mobilities. For example, those who were able to source funding for themselves or have been funded through other sources. Organizational support can be used toward costs for these participants if requested at application stage. A budget category called expensive travel costs has been introduced. If your project has been awarded this type of budget, you should further read in your guidelines how to correctly claim the costs. Expensive travel costs replace the standard travel grant. You are also reminded that the final budget summary awarded is an estimate, and that expenditure throughout the project should match it as closely as possible. This is because durations and destinations are not being defined at the application stage, so this allows more flexibility when managing the project. Moving on to the next slide. I am now going to cover the key sections of your 2020 grant agreement. As you know, the grant agreement is the contract you need to sign with the national agency that states the rules of the funding. It is very important to read it in full and be aware of your obligations. In this slide, we have highlighted the main sections of the grant agreement that hold the key information for your project. Article 1.2 states the duration of the project, along with the start and end date. Article 1.3 states the total grant awarded. Budget transfer rules can be found in Article 1.3.3. This section outlines the specific rules for making budget transfers. We will go over these in greater detail in the next slides. Between Articles 1.4.1 to Articles 1.4.4, you will be able to find explanations about reporting to the UK National Agency, both for interim reports and final reports. These articles give you the dates which reports should be submitted and the stipulations for triggering payments. They also contain your project payment structure. In Article 1.4.9, exchange rates you need to use can be found. The exchange rate for your project should always be taken from the day you receive your most recent payment from the national agency, and the rate should always be calculated from the Commission's own currency conversion tool. In Article 1.5 and Article 1.6.2, bank details and contact details can be found. The national agency can only issue funds into this account and contact the individual stated in this article, as well as the design legal representative. The UK National Agency will not discuss important matters of your project with any other person not indicated in the grant agreement. This is why it is important that if either contact person or legal representative changes, you communicate the change to us as soon as possible. As a new addition, 2019 brought the addition of a new annex, Annex 6 GDPR. It was a new annex added for 2019 projects, which set out GDPR requirements in relation to the Erasmus Plus grant. Other than this, the grant agreement remains essentially the same as in 2018. Moving on to the next slide. This section will go through some of your responsibilities for managing your grant and what support you can expect from your project officer at the national agency. Your responsibilities will be slightly different depending on whether you are the sole beneficiary or the coordinator of a UK consortium. As a sole beneficiary, you must familiarize yourself with the grant agreement. You are responsible for ensuring that your project is implemented in line with the activities plan in your application and within the rules outlined in the grant agreement. You must ensure that your project activities are eligible. If in doubt, please read the Handbook Guidance 2020 Erasmus Programme or contact your project officer. You must inform us of any changes you wish to make regarding your application form, as some of them may not be eligible, in which case funding provided cannot be used to cover them. You need to keep all necessary documents. All documents related to the project, invoices, agreements between participants and yourself, need to be kept in the event of a desk check or if the national agency requests them at any point. Ensure that the templates that are provided are actually used, as we will expect to see them when completing the checks. You need to use the IT tools mandatory to manage the project, such as Mobility Tool Plus and Participant Portal, as these have to be used consistently throughout the delivery of the project. It is also important to submit your reports in line with what is stipulated in your grant agreement. This includes the deadlines and the required information. Failure to do so could result in late payments to your project, or no payments at all if deadlines are missed and the necessary documentation is not provided. On the other hand, as a consortium coordinator, you have the same responsibilities. However, you also need to make sure your consortium partners are aware of all eligibility requirements for activities and costs. As a coordinator, you need to act as a liaison for the national agency if any information is updated either by the national agency or one of your consortium members. It is also your responsibility to inform your consortium members that they need to update documents and update the portal if things change that we would need to be aware of. Moving on to the next slide. In this slide, we can see some information regarding contract amendments. And the UK National Agency contemplates that during your project life cycle, there may be some changes to the process that may affect the content of your grant agreement. These changes are called contract amendments, and those are differentiated into two types: minor changes and significant changes. Firstly, we have the minor changes. These are administrative changes to the project. A formal request and approval is required by the national agency, as minor changes alter some of the content in the grant agreement. Beneficiaries are required to submit a minor change form and complete the relevant actions detailed in the form. Some examples of minor amendments are changes such as changes to contact person or legal representative, changes to bank details, and changes to the number of OLS licenses required. Minor changes are typically approved with no supplementary agreement required. We also have the significant changes, and these are the deviations from the delivery of the project as outlined in your application form. As such, they may result in altering the project-specific content of the grant agreement, and they have the potential to call into question the decision of the initial application assessment, or have a significant financial and legal impact. To request a significant change, you are expected to submit a formal contract amendment request, providing a clear justification for the proposed changes. Requests must be submitted well in advance and no later than a month prior to the project end date. Again, this form should be requested from your project officer. Some examples of significant amendments are changes to the nature of project activities, or changes to the legal status of your organization. The request will be formally assessed by the national agency, and if approved, a supplementary agreement will be produced and must be signed by both parties. It will then be annexed to the original grant agreement. Significant change requests are deemed exceptional and carry no guarantee of approval from the national agency. Some changes that cannot be permitted include those surrounding project budget, the reporting schedule, and change of beneficiary organization. These changes are not permitted. Moving on to the next slide. I am now going to move on into a new topic, which is budget transfers. And I'm going to briefly explain the main rules on how to process those. There were some updates to budget transfers in the 2019 call, as the scope and flexibility has been increased to the changes and how mobility data was entered onto the 2019 application forms. These rules are maintained for 2020 call. Within your Key Action 1 project, you're able to transfer certain elements of your grant between the different budget headings. Budget transfers offer flexibility to increase mobility numbers or give favor to certain types of mobility activities and special needs supports. These transfers to and from different budget categories are percentage-based. As the beneficiary, you will be responsible for calculating the maximum transferable amount. The full rules for budget transfers can be found in Article 1.3.3 of your grant agreement. This sets out the circumstances in which you can transfer funding between budget headings. We strongly recommend that you read this article carefully and familiarize yourselves with the rules. When planning to make a budget transfer, you should first consider how the change will affect the achievement of the original project objectives or results. If you're unsure, speak to your project officer. If planning to use budget transfers within your project, you should make sure it is in line with what your grant allows, and make sure this is explained within your final report at the end of your project. It is also highly advised to let your project officer at the NA know, so that when we monitor your project in Mobility Tool Plus, we can understand if any budget headings are looking higher or lower than expected. Moving on to the next slide. Here we have compiled some examples of budget transfers that would be allowed, and some that are not permitted. For instance, some of not permitted changes are that funds allocated to organizational support cannot be increased. Funds allocated for special needs support and exceptional costs cannot be transferred to any other budget category. Some permitted changes are that, for instance, 20% of the funds allocated for Erasmus Pro activities can be transferred to any other type of activity. Funds allocated for Erasmus Pro advanced planning visits can be increased by a maximum of 20%. Funds initially allocated for staff mobility can be increased by a max of 20%. These are some examples of changes that you can do within a budget transfer. Moving on to the next slide. I would now like to outline that record keeping is an essential component of managing your grant. Documents are required to be retained in order to evidence activities carried out. Rules for the types of documents that need to be retained can be found in Annex 1 and 3 of the grant agreement. They are broken down by budget category. The national agency also requires certain templates from Annex 5 to be used. Some documents will be inspected during NA checks, as well as European Commission audits. The main source of information for record keeping can be found in Annex 3 of your grant agreement. In this annex, the requirements are broken down by budget category. Some of these documents are Certificate of Attendance of Participants. This document is a proof of attendance of the activity in the form of a declaration signed by the receiving organization specifying the name of the participant, the purpose of activity, as well as its starting and end date. The Learning Grant Agreement. VET learners must have a grant agreement in place that is signed by themselves and the sending organization before they go on mobility. The learning agreement should cover the learning outcomes for the participant and how these will be achieved. The staff grant agreement. Before staff undertake mobility, they must have a grant agreement in place that is signed by themselves and the receiving organization. Invoices to prove actual costs. In the case of costs related to the participation of learners with fewer opportunities, invoices of the actual costs incurred, specifying the name and address of the body issuing the invoice, the amount of currency, and the date of the invoice. Accounting records that proved individual support travel was transferred to participants. Also, to prove that travel or individual support was spent on behalf of participants. These are documents that we require and that all projects should have in place. Now, moving on to the next slide, I am now going to cover Mobility Tool Plus. Mobility Tool is the online management and reporting system for all projects awarded a grant under the European Commission Erasmus Plus program. It has been developed by the European Commission, and it is a contractual requirement for all Erasmus Plus, KA1 and VET adult education to use the tool in order to report the activities to the national agency. All KA1 beneficiaries must at least once a month during the project encode and update any new information regarding the participants and the mobility activities. Please upload information at least once a month during the project lifetime. Do not leave this until the very end of the project, as it allows the national agency to monitor the progress. Please be aware that the national agency may review monitoring levels and or risk ratings if beneficiaries do not update the tool frequently. We recommend that you set a recurring date every month where you can check and update the tool and all the details regarding your project activities. These may include inputting new mobilities and budget information following an event or a meeting. So moving into the next slide. As you know, 100% of participant report submission is a contractual requirement. This means that all participants should submit a participant report in order to be eligible for funding. But how can beneficiaries check which participants have submitted their reports? Within the Mobilities tab, the reporting columns show that the status of a participant report. It's either requested, submitted, but it also can be undelivered. This means that the report was not sent successfully to the email address given. The status can also be none if the mobility is yet to finish. This is how you can check if participants have submitted the report. The reporting columns also state when a participant report was requested and when it was received by Mobility Tool Plus. Moving on to the next slide. We can see there is an interesting feature in Mobility Tool called Import-Export. The main purpose of this feature is to enable beneficiaries of large-scale projects with a large number of participants to enter data into Mobility Tool Plus in a more efficient way by adding multiple participants at the same time. However, these should only be used if you have a very large-scale projects. Otherwise, we recommend that you continue to click the green button Create to open and create mobilities from within the Mobilities tab individually. However, if you would like to choose this option from the Mobility Import-Export tab, then you have to click either the Export SCV or Export XLS to open the file with all mobilities data that has been input into the Mobility Tool Plus. Then, to successfully import mobilities, you will need to use the Mobility Tool Data Dictionary. This can be downloaded from the Mobility Import-Export tab as well. The Data Dictionary includes guidance about how the mobility information should be encoded for this file to allow Mobility Tool Plus to understand the data. To import the information, click the Select File button under the Import Complete section and select the file you have just saved. For more information on importing, we recommend the European Commission's step-by-step guidance videos. Moving on to the next topic, and next slide. I am now going to cover monitoring conducted by the national agency. Both the national agency and you, as the beneficiary, are responsible for monitoring the project throughout its life cycle. Monitoring activities help us to inspect the progress of the project and to check if activities undertaken are in line with rules of the grant agreement, as well as the objectives. This way we can recognize potential problems early on and offer help and advice if needed. Monitoring will also help us identify best practice projects. Your project officer might also want to put forward your project as best practice to be used as case study for our website or general Erasmus Plus promotional material. There are different types of monitoring that you should be aware of: mobility tool checks, quarterly emails, or quarterly calls. For mobility tool checks, all projects will be subject to monitoring by the national agency. The main way the national agency will be able to monitor your project is in the Mobility Tool Plus. Using this tool, your project officer will be able to see what the project progress is and if all expected flows are taking place. The national agency conducts monitoring calls, monitoring visits, and in some cases financial desk checks, which we will cover later. Also, if your project has been selected for monitoring emails or calls, your project officer will contact you to organize this. As a beneficiary, you're responsible for continually evaluating the project and updating us of any changes or developments. Quarterly emails and calls should include details of any issues with the host or consortium partners, details of financial management arrangements, any new project outcomes since the last monitoring email, evaluation and dissemination, and possible issues. Of course, it's also your chance to tell us what areas you're particularly proud of and to raise any questions or concerns you have. Your project officer may then be able to give you some recommendations or specific action points. It is a contractual obligation to provide us all information requested by us, and to take part in regular monitoring calls or emails if your project has been selected for one of them. Non-compliance may result in a suspension of your project until you provide the necessary information. You should therefore contact your project officer immediately if you foresee that you won't be available for the agreed phone call time, or to send the email as agreed and explain why. Moving on to the next slide. I am now going to cover different types of checks that are done apart from the usual monitoring. The UK National Agency may select your project for a further check, where the UK National Agency requests to see some documents related to your project. There are 4 main types of checks, all described in detail in the handbook and grant agreement. I will now briefly detail what each one of these entail. As a main rule, when facing any of these checks, remember that good record keeping is essential in order to comply with the national agency checks. All required documents must be readily available at your main address and contain the same information entered on your participant portal. Moving on to the next slide, please. First of all, I am going to cover desk checks. A random selection of projects will be selected for this. A desk check is an in-depth check of a project after the final report submission. It is undertaken at the national agency premises on the basis of supporting documents that you will be required to submit to us. Copies of documents are requested via email, but you must keep the originals. Documents required for a desk check. Some of the documents are declarations of attendance for all participants, information about how individual support was paid to participants or on behalf of participants, exchange rates used, sample of participant grant agreements and learning or training agreements, certification of recognition or learning outcomes such as Europass Mobility, linguistic support documents, for example, declaration of attendance of a language course. Also, for adult education projects, course fees, such as proof of enrollment in course, and payment of course fees. Special needs also, if requested, you must then provide invoices of the actual cost incurred and any other relevant evidence, such as proof of special needs. Moving on to the next slide. I am now going to cover what the monitoring visit entails. A random selection of projects may be selected for monitoring visits. The focus here is on the quality of any results achieved and processes, rather than an in-depth financial check. The visit is an opportunity for you to take stock of the project achievements and review your progress against the objectives. You will also be able to seek clarification and guidance. The national agency will also explore examples of best practice. The information gathered will form part of our monitoring and Erasmus Plus program as a whole, and will be used to inform reports produced by the national agency. During the visit, progress will be assessed against objectives set out in your original application. You will usually be visited by your project officer and another NA representative. The visit will usually last half a working day, but may be longer in some instances. Monitoring visits are supposed to be more practical and in-depth than monitoring calls or emails. We would therefore like to actually see the templates and documents you use to run your project successfully. We also expect to meet at least one of your participants for part of the visit. You should provide a valid reason if this is not possible, though. Moving on to the next slide, I am going to cover on-the-spot checks and system checks. The national agency will also complete on-the-spot financial checks on project activities or triggering events during a random sample of monitoring visits. Triggering events for VET projects are the participant mobilities, both students as staff as well. For adult education projects, this also includes the actual courses undertaken during the mobility itself. This check is similar to a desk check, but the national agency will undertake a deeper check on accounting systems and will expect to talk to staff. The purpose of on-the-spot check is to provide assurance on the legality and eligibility of the project activities. During the check, the financial management and record keeping will be looked at to ensure it's appropriate. You should make sure that all necessary documents are available and that people dealing with the finance side of your project are also present to answer any questions we may have. We will let you know ahead of time if your project has been selected and which documents you should provide. You should ensure all your documents are collected, filed correctly, up to date, continuously throughout the project. In addition to some of the documents mentioned before for a desk check, you will also need documents such as partner agreements, timelines, budget spreadsheet, documents providing your participants are eligible, for instance, vocational education certificates. The originals must be available. System checks, on the other hand, take place on top funding receivers and VMC holders. System checks is done in two phases. The first one looks at the overall procedures within your organization to ensure an efficient delivery of projects. The system checks will not focus on just one project, but all the KA1 VET and adult education projects of an organization. Phase 2 will be an on-the-spot check, but for a completed Erasmus KA1 project, and all rules of a normal on-the-spot check apply. We also will let you know ahead of time if you've been selected for a system check with more detailed information. Some documents needed for phase 1 of a system checks will be project and financial management documents or systems, for example, proof of an accounting system or quality assurance procedures, participant selection, preparation of activities, safety of participants, agreements with partners and participants, mentoring documents, recognition of learning outcomes, and also proof of dissemination, evaluation, and impact assessment. We will now move into the next slide. And I will briefly cover some types of reports that you need to be familiar with: interim report, participant reports, and final reports. Apart from these reports, you should also report back to us during the lifetime of your project and let us know how your project is getting on, regardless if you need to provide a report soon or not. Moving on to the next slide. First of all, I'm going to speak about interim reports. And as you know, they are typically required for any organization that have payment structures for 2 or more pre-financing payments. Therefore, this report needs to be submitted in order to request the next pre-financing installment of your grant. Interim reports will be sent to you by email, along with guidance by your project officer in order to complete them. The report is intended to provide a snapshot of the development of your project, and as such, you should include information on the activities undertaken to date, project expenditure, and any examples of best practice. Information on how your project is being managed, details of difficulties you may have encountered, and how these are being addressed. If the report is an eligible request for the next payment, then the national agency will make a payment due within 60 days of receiving the report. The reporting period and submission deadline for your interim report of progress can be found in an Article 1.4 of your grant agreement, if this applies to your organization. The reports will be assessed against your application form. Therefore, you are required to make sure information is consistent. If you are expecting any changes, make sure to include them and contact your project officer. Moving on to the next slide. I am now going to cover participant reports. As you know, all VET learners and staff, including adult education staff who have completed a mobility activities abroad, must complete a participant report after the end of the mobility. The only exception to this are accompanying persons who do not need to complete this. Completion of the participant report is obligatory for all who take part, and it is your responsibility as the project coordinator to ensure that all of your participants fill in and submit the participant report. The participant report takes the form of an online survey hosted by the EU Survey, and asks the learner or staff member to rate their mobility experience based on a number of different factors, such as the quality of the placement, the level of support received from the sending and receiving organizations, and their own personal development. Once the participant has completed and submitted this report, a PDF copy appears in the mobility tool and can be viewed by the project coordinator. The mobility tool will automatically send an email with a link to the survey to each participant the day after the mobility ended into the tool. We would recommend that you get participants to complete them while the mobility experience is still fresh in their minds, and while you are still able to contact them to ensure 100% completion of reports. Moving on into the next slide. Last but not least, you will need to submit your final report once your project has ended. We'd like to run through some of the issues that we encounter when assessing final reports, which often lead to resubmissions, lower scores, or even reductions to the awarded budget. You should know that the final report automatically pre-fills information from the mobility tool. However, most of the narrative sections have to be manually completed, and this should not be copy-pasted version of your application form. We are happy for you to use your application to reference original aims, objectives, and plans. However, the final report should be written after activities have taken place and tell us what actually happened. Please always check your budget. This is to ensure that activity types match what you have been awarded, and that the selected distance bands are correct, and that accompanying persons have been selected correctly. You should also mention whether you performed any budget transfer so that our assessors are aware. Thirdly, please include as much detail as possible. The final report has a number of narrative sections that you need to complete, which ask about various elements of the project life cycle. We would recommend that you write in as much detail as possible for each element, so the assessor gets a clear idea of how the project has been managed and can score accordingly. If something has gone wrong during the course of the project, also include detail on this and how you try to rectify the situation. Changes to the proposed activities do not necessarily mean a low score. Impact and dissemination sections should report on your activities to promote the project outcomes and to share them with your stakeholders. It is important that you put special effort on this section, as it helps us identify how the project impacted on both participants and organizations, but also identify best practice and case studies to follow up with. Moving on to the next slide. It is possible for your grant total to be reduced based on the scoring awarded during the final report assessment. This is a rare occurrence, but stems from the poor implementation of a project or a poor quality final report. At the outcome of the final report assessment, 25% of your organizational support will be cut if the final report scores between 40 and below 50 points. It will be 50% cut if the final report scores between 25 and below 40 points, and 75% cut if the final report scores below 25 points. A grant reduction is also applied to the individual support and travel headings where there are missing participant reports. Moving on to the next slide. I will now cover what is EPRP, why to use it, and how to use it. EPRP is the Erasmus Project Results Platform, on which projects can disseminate results. However, this is not a contractual requirement for KA1 projects to disseminate on the platform, but it is definitely seen as a good practice. You can upload results on the platform, such as videos, reports from an event, leaflets relevant to the dissemination plan of your project. Guidance on relevant project results is available in the platform. Additionally, the platform can increase your international scope as the public interface allows anyone to view your project profile. You could be identified by other organizations as a potential partner for future projects. If you wish to have further guidance on the EPRP, please contact your project officer. Moving on to the next slide. This section will cover some aspects for those of you who have requested and have been approved to use OLS licenses. This is legally defined in the special conditions of your grant agreement, so please check the relevant article if you have been awarded OLS licenses. Annex 3 also covers the roles and responsibilities all parties involved, specifically beneficiary organization. These responsibilities include obligations such as that the beneficiary must make every effort to ensure that all the allocated licenses are actively used by the select participants, and that participants commit themselves by signing the individual mobility grant agreement to complete the OLS language assessment before the mobility period and to follow the OLS language course if awarded. So how are OLS licenses allocated? The NA will allocate beneficiaries with a number of licenses that are indicated in your grant agreement. The named OLS contact person in the application form will receive login details for the platform. Beneficiaries will be required to distribute the assessment licenses and course license to eligible participants. Beneficiaries will also be able to monitor progress, review the results, and analyze each participant language capabilities. Once licenses are allocated, participants will receive login details via email, which allows them to complete their user profile and start the first assessment. Each beneficiary is also provided with access to one assessment and one course license for demonstration purpose. Due to various reasons, you may have to request additional OLS licenses, contact your named project officer, who will make these changes. An important function for you to keep an eye on whether their participants are completing their assessments and courses. And they can do this by clicking on the License Usage per Participant tab. Here you can check, for instance, when first and second assessment have been completed and the language level achieved. This will be your main tool to ensure maximum take-up of licenses, and if necessary, chase participants who have not made progress. The OLS platform has a VEN support area, where the VEN user guide is available as well as technical questions and answers. Finally, if you continue to encounter issues with the OLS platform or your assigned licenses, you can use the Report a Problem section to request further support. Moving to the next slide, please. We are now approaching the end of the webinar, and I would like you to remind you where you can seek for further support and where to check the rules for the 2020 call. As you're aware now, the main point of contact will be your project officer, who will assist you throughout the life cycle of project. They will also provide you the forms for processes such as monitoring or contract amendments. If they are away from the office or unavailable, you will be also given the contact details for the general inbox and a helpline, where you can contact any of our staff members who are happy to help. The 2020 handbook will be sent to you electronically. It will also be uploaded to our website, and we strongly recommend that you read this thoroughly. This document will provide you with everything you need surrounding each aspect of the project life cycle. It provides information and guidance and should be used in the first instance when encountering difficulties and queries. The 2020 Erasmus Program Guide is also a great source of information for anything related to the project. We would especially recommend using it when you're unsure if a proposed activity or change to the project is eligible according to the key action that you are contracted to. This is also available in our website. We would strongly recommend you sign up for our newsletter online if you haven't already done so. It provides monthly updates on events, activities, case studies, news, Brexit updates, and general information. Additionally, the Erasmus website contains also a lot of information on Erasmus projects. And a particularly useful section is the FAQ page. The website is updated on a regular basis and will provide you with up-to-date information. It also signposts you to help and support for areas such as EPALE, ECVET, Mobility Tool Plus, or OLS. Finally, please note that we do aim to host a formal startup convention in October, but this may be subject to change due to the continued developments in government guidelines. Further information and invitations will be sent to you once a date has been confirmed and necessary arrangements will be made. And just moving on to the last slide. This is the end of the webinar, and we really hope that this was useful. Finally, please, here are our contact details if you ever need to get in touch. Our helpline hours are normally 9 until 7:30 on Mondays to Thursday, and it closes slightly early on Fridays at 5. Due to the COVID situation, our helpline is currently closed, but you can still reach us via email. Our email is erasmusplus@ecoris.com. For any questions specific to your organization, they can be emailed to the Erasmus Plus inbox. Please note that we try to ensure emails are answered within 2 working days, but there may be a delay due to current circumstances. Please remember to always quote your project reference number, as this facilitates tailoring the response to your needs. We wish you the best of luck with your Erasmus Plus projects. I want to remind you that we are on hand for support and guidance where necessary. Thank you very much.